Okay, um, so here we are again. The next part of the lecture. Unfortunately, in the last recording, something went wrong and you couldn't see the slides while I'm talking. So I am solving it simply by doing it again. Hopefully this one will work better and also the upload will work better. So what you've seen in the last section was this documentary from the BBC where you got acquainted with the drama and the bad situation of housing, overcrowding, bad health situation in different English cities. So this has also been documented in a book which became quite famous. So the title of the book is Bitter Cry of Outcast London, yeah, which became one of the first of this series of books that have been written about different cities. I think in the documentary, the bad living conditions were explained quite well, and it was also well explained how the lack of functioning infrastructure is one of the biggest obstacles for providing good quality of housing, good quality of life in the city. So probably the most important factor is the water, black water, sewage, but also fresh water intake. And then, of course, the organization of the city, providing enough housing close to the places of work. Next image is pretty much repeating what has been there before, what has been said before. I found it quite interesting to see this kind of diagrammatic section because, yeah, here you can see how bad the situation was, how much it was overcrowded. Even though the house is not extremely bad in itself, you know, it's a proper house, it's not a shed or a slum, but still it becomes a substandard way of living due to the overcrowding. They use every little bit of space, including this space in between the ground floor and the foundation, which is of course not supposed to be for living. One other anecdote I think is quite interesting to hear is how this overcrowding is connected to idea of safety. If you see this overcrowded house, then you can imagine that people frequently go in and out. So if people go in and out all the time, at some point they stop bothering about closing front door. So this, on the other hand, invites another group of people who are even poorer than the ones you see in this illustration, and those are the ones that are completely homeless out on the streets. So what happens now is, because the doors are open or not locked, homeless might come in and then start sleeping in the hallway. So of course that even exemplifies or extends the amount of how you can feel unsafe due to overcrowding. From here we go on and yeah, pointing out how this social problem also becomes political problem of whole society. So with this overcrowding and this poverty that was everywhere, at some point people just don't take it anymore, right? So at some point people don't accept those kind of living conditions anymore and start protesting, and maybe they will also start rioting. So that also happened in England in the wake of industrialization and urbanization. And therefore it also becomes a point on the political agenda, right? Something needs to be done about overcrowding. You cannot just ignore it. and deal with it like that's somebody else's problem, that's just a problem of the poor, or that's just a problem of the industry, factory owners, so they should work with it. No, that doesn't work anymore, because at some point it becomes a societal problem and something needs to be done. So for this, sorry, another alarm. So for this, the public will introduce a new set of rules and regulations. So this is the policy side of the tackling the problem. So as I said in the introduction, there's like a couple of separate kind of strategies how one has to deal with overcrowding or city planning in general. So on the one hand, of course, that's the spatial side, how you organize it, how you distribute densities, what kind of function is where, the kind of land use planning, together with transportation planning. But of course, it's also about rules and regulations. So that's another part. And then third one we're going to talk about a little bit as well is the financing. So you can have the best of ideas and the best of noble incentives, but if you don't have the money to finance what you wish, then you won't have any possibility of implementing those ideas. So city government and national government understood that something needed to be done, and rules and regulations were put in place. And you're not supposed to remember all of these regulations. It's not going to be part of the exam. It's more about that they're improving this kind of regulatory framework, and that has an impact on how the city looks, how the city works, and obviously helps to understand why the city looks and feels the way that it is today. The most important act here is that Torrance Act, or Artisans' Dwellings Act, which allowed the city hall or public officials to purchase housing that is below a certain standard. So if you have really bad housing, normally that is occupied by poor people, and those poor people don't have money to invest to improve their situation. So with this act, now the public can come in and buy it from those landowners and develop it themselves, or through some kind of public agency, or sell it to a commercial developer. Doesn't matter so much. The main point is that there is now a regulation in place that allows the public to step in and be active and try to improve the situation. There are different ways in which this has been used. So this is an example of a dwelling development called Peabody. And in this case, a poor rundown area has been purchased, and then Mr. Peabody, a rich man that became rich through industrialization from owning factories, is giving back to society. So what he's doing is building this housing project called after himself, Peabody, and the way that this was attractive for the public was that there was a private person that would do the investment. Providing housing is expensive, so of course public would be happy if some private entity would take over, like Peabody in this case. Just see, okay. I will get back to these kind of developments. So what you see is that in this solution, You have very compact housing. You have a very well-defined urban block. Outside, inside is very well defined. Outside is the public, inside is the semi-public space with a square that is mainly intended for the people that live around, but also is reachable from the outside for everybody. That's why it's called semi-public. And then the outside facades are much more representative and taken care of, and also more detailed and more expensive, and inside facades are more sober and less elegant. Like this, several developments would appear. This is Bensall Green State, another one of these philanthropic developments. And the idea is relatively similar, right? You have a couple of blocks that follow the outline of the urban block. So this pretty much follows the line of the street. On the back side there's a courtyard, and that courtyard is shared. It is mainly intended again for the people that live here, but also open for outsiders. You see that the industrialization is also having an effect on the architecture. So there's a lot of repetition taking place. These blocks are very similar, only the corner elements are different. Yeah, also here, of course, a former slum area has been replaced with this. Let's go to the next one also. At the time, this was considered quite harsh. It was more dense than what people were used to, more repetitive than what people were used to, and therefore people didn't like it that much. From today's perspective, probably quite neat actually. You see a lot of attention for detail compared to serial housing as we know it from Korea, for example, but also other countries. Yeah, there's ornamentation on the facade. There's different treatment of the ground floor and the upper floors. You have something that is also quite in trend today, which relates to the idea of compact city, which means you have small shops and facilities for daily public life integrated into the design. And then from today's perspective, this kind of urban courtyard, urban square on the backside is also not too bad. So actually today it's quite a popular place to live, but back in the days this was considered harsh architecture and too much, too dense, too repetitive. Yeah, I've talked about Peabody already. So that is the layout that I mainly focused on, relating inside and outside. Here in this illustration you see the facade. Despite it being like one development, they still try to emulate the idea of having a grown city. So facade looks different, as if different houses have been individually built next to one another. And then if we look at the floor plan, we see a lot of repetition, right? So this is again housing for the poor, not the poorest, but for the people with not much money. The layout is quite efficient. Central staircase, double loaded corridor with units on each side. Units are quite small. Here 2 rooms, sometimes 3. And it was a luxury to have water closet. So these are located at the ends of the corridor on the outside. And here again, the points that I mentioned before, they were not very popular, these new buildings. Density was too high. There was a lack of greenery. The facades were considered very grim. Regulations were petty, so yeah, it has to mean you had to be silent at some point. And there were very clear instructions how you had to use the space and how you had to leave it, which was considered petty by some. And then this is maybe the most important point, because we're talking about like how these new developments make a contribution to tackling the problem of overcrowding. These developments would not help the very poor, right? They would help like workers or maybe lower middle class incomes, but not the poorest. So in a way, there's a process of gentrification taking place. So the poorest, economically weakest people used to live here. Then the land was bought by the city and it replaced and with these buildings. And now the people that are coming in are from slightly higher economic status, even though they're not rich. They're still a little bit richer than the people that lived here in the first place. So this is of course some critique on the strategy, but at the moment that was the best they managed to do. This is about the efficiency. So if you look at London, during the time of industrialization, all the industries had to be well connected to the markets and the places where the goods were sold, and all the raw materials had to come into the factories, right? So for the economy it was really important to have the factories well connected, and for that new roads would have been built and new rails would have been built as well. So if you do the calculation and see how much has been built, or sorry, how much housing has been destroyed in order to build roads and railroads, compared to the housing units that have actually been built through these philanthropic projects, then you see that due to construction of roads, about 100,000 units have been destroyed, another 76,000 have been destroyed due to rail construction, and only roughly 17,000 have been built through these philanthropic projects. So maybe in essence they're very well meant, but considering the scale of the problem of overcrowding, actually the situation got worse during those years, because overall housing became even more scarce than it was before, due to the demolition that also took place. I was already pointing out riots when the poor simply don't take it anymore. So one of the most important, biggest riots in Britain at the time was the Bloody Sunday. Yeah, this is not too important, also not exam relevant. And now we go into this new type of discipline, academic discipline, urban discipline, that emerged. So now there was a need to understand better how these cities emerge and how they function. So this is one of the first examples of urban mapping, where the subjects of like policy or urban policy, sociology and spatial design overlap. Charles Booth tried to understand better how the social structure in the city works and created these poverty maps. So he would, according to this legenda, see which type of income would live where and map that in London. So out of that he was hoping to figure out which are the areas that need attention first. So public resources could be like very effective, right? If you know what are the worst places, then you can tackle those first and then increase living standards more quickly. What I quite like is that you see which areas are the most wanted. So most of the time the well-to-do people or the wealthy live along the big streets, the better public spaces, and the more you go inside or to the back side, the less valuable the ground becomes, and the poorer the people that live there. So, of course, here income is linked to social status and to problems like infant mortality and crime. It's probably not very politically correct and not very true in all cases, but as a guideline, it kind of worked here. Here you see an example of an area that is pretty run down. You see that still on the outside there's relative wealth, but then the further you go inside the block, the more poor people become. And when you go there, you also figure out that area are more run down. So this would be one of the areas that is redeveloped, and we have some images about that as well. Yeah, just as a short intermezzo, so here you see the relation between public interventions, like making new regulations, making new policy in order to tackle the problem of overcrowding. And here you see life expectancy. So there's a relation between the policies that were put in place and increasing standard of life. This is now back to the area that we looked at before, Charles Booth's maps. This is a very old map of that area from 1800 roughly, where you see that this is before industrialization starts. So here you have agriculture within the boundaries of London, pretty low density along the bigger streets. There's row housing, kind of forming continuous facades, but you don't have very much defined urban blocks, maybe in this area. But for the rest, there's still a combination of agriculture and urban use at the same time. Couple of public facilities. There's the church here, brewery down there. And if we go to the next plan, then we see more and more people move to the city and space gets used more efficiently. So now this becomes very packed, urban, very dense area, very well defined urban blocks, where you have the housing on the outside and then you have private gardens on the inside, and this becomes the urban block. Public facilities are still there and some industries are still there. This is the church. The brewery should be down here, and there are some schools emerging around here. Yeah, so this kind of works, but it's not very exciting, right? Urban space, very little public space, mainly the streets are the public space, but very little leisure space, right? There's no park or place where you could get together or where the community can get together. It's either kind of transportation on the street or private space inside the house or in the backyard. So that is obviously missing something for the community, something to get together. That plan has been replaced with this redevelopment plan. So it's eradicating most of the existing urban structure but still leaving some. So we can still see the church up here, schools down here, but those urban blocks have been cut up, the islands have become a different shape, and of course there's this big public space in the center, kind of working like a star. So literally it becomes the place where people conglomerate in the center of this neighborhood, where there could be events, flea markets, and so on. So density looks less on this map. Sorry, I should be more precise. So the figure ground map shows less of the floor space is being used. There's more white, less black, but density is higher than before, simply because these buildings are higher than those houses that have been built before. If we go to the next one, here you see images. So instead of those 1 or 2 floor houses, it's been replaced with these much more urban typology of 4, 5, or sometimes 6 floors of housing. And then there's backsides, similar to what we've seen in Peabody, become communal spaces. What you see here, so there could be some community gardens, kind of more informal spaces there, and then you have the big communal space in the center that could be used for events or other activities. So diversity of spaces is much more increased, density increased also a lot, and public spaces are created by this strategy of creating more density. Here again, similar to what we've seen before, repetition in the architecture. Facades at the time were considered grim, but but what is good is that you would have public facilities and facilities for everyday life located on ground floor. That means little shops, post office, these kind of things that you need are there, which helps people in their everyday life. Today you would call that compact city, and is something that is actually quite wanted in modern city planning. So if you look at the floor plans, quite similar to what we've seen before: central staircase, corridor, and then relatively small units connected to the corridor, and communal or shared bathrooms on the corridor. I think it's better to stop the video here, and then I upload a second one and kind of do it in small batches. So next case is Berlin, and that we can see in the next video.